So far in this section, we have talked about Mongoose models, CRUD operations with Mongoose, we did a lot of querying, and we learned about the aggregation pipeline. But now, for the next couple of videos, let's actually return to our data model and learn some super useful features that Mongoose offers us in order to model our data. And the first one we're going to talk about are virtual properties. And so let's open up our tool model here. Alright, now virtual properties are basically fields that we can define on our schema, but that will not be persisted. So they will not be saved into the database in order to save us some space there. And most of the time, of course, we want to really save our data to the database, but virtual properties make a lot of sense for fields that can be derived from one another. For example, a conversion from miles to kilometers. It doesn't make sense to store these two fields in a database if we can easily convert one to the other, right? Okay, so let's now define a virtual property that contains the tour duration in weeks. And so that's a field, basically, that we can very easily convert from the duration that we already have in days, right? And so here is how it works. So we define that virtual properties on the tour schema, and so we say tour schema dot virtual and then the name of the virtual property. So let's call it duration weeks. And then on there we need to define the get method. And that's just because this virtual property here will basically be created each time that we get some data out of the database. And so this get function here is called a getter. Alright, now in here we pass a function, and actually this callback function is going to be a real function, so not an arrow function, and I'm going to explain to you why in a second. Okay, now how do we then basically define the virtual property? Well, it's very simple. All we have to say is that we want to return this dot duration, in this case, divided by 7. Okay, so this is how we calculate the duration in weeks. So the duration in days divided by 7, because there are 7 days in the week. And so that's then the duration in weeks. For example, if a tour has 7 days, then it's of course going to be 1 week. Now I used this regular function here because remember, an arrow function does not get its own this keyword. But in here we actually need the this keyword, because the this keyword in this case is going to be pointing to the current document. Alright? And so usually when we want to use this, then we should always use a normal, a regular function. Alright? So really everywhere in Mongoose, I'm going to always be using these regular functions that we're used to. Okay? So give it a save here. And that's actually it. That's how we define duration weeks, which is not going to be persisted in the database, but it's only going to be there as soon as we get the data. Now, right now, it's actually not going to be there yet, because there's one piece missing here. So let me start by showing you that. So if we try to get all tours, you will see that duration weeks is nowhere to be found here. Okay? And that's because we need to explicitly define in our schema that we want the virtual properties in our output. Okay? And so remember how I said that here into this mongoose.schema, we can pass in not only the object with the schema definition itself, but also an object for the schema options. Okay? And so let's add that here at the end. So this first object here is the schema definition, and now second, an object for the options. And what we need to specify here is the toJSON property here. And what we say is then that each time that the data is actually outputted as JSON, we want virtuals to be true. So basically the virtuals to be part of the output. Okay, and now I'm duplicating this because we also want to say toObject. So basically when the data gets outputted as an object. And so if we now go back here, we should then be able to see duration weeks. So let's wait for it. And indeed, here it is. So it's 5 days, and so that is 0.71 weeks. Here we have 7 days, and so that's 1 week. Okay, so that actually works. Great. Now, one thing that we need to keep in mind is that we cannot use this virtual property here in a query, okay? Because they're technically not part of the database. So we cannot say, for example, tour.find where duration weeks is equal to 1. Okay, that's not going to work, again, because this property is not actually part of the database. Now, of course, we could also have done this conversion each time after we query the data, for example, like in a controller, but that would not be the best practice, simply because we want to try to keep business logic and application logic as much separated as possible. Remember? So that was that whole talk about fat models and thin controllers that we talked about before, which says that we should have models with as much business logic as we can offload to them and thin controllers with as little business logic as possible. Okay, and so virtual properties like this are actually a good example of how we can achieve that kind of architecture. All right, so knowing the duration in weeks is a business logic because it has to do with the business itself, not with stuff like requests or responses. And so we do the calculation right in the model where it belongs and not in the controller. All right?